Let's get started. Welcome to the Strauss Center. I'm Patricia McLaughlin. I'm with the Department of Government and the Center of East Asian Studies, way at the other side of campus. And it's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the Center for inviting me to what I think could not be a more timely talk in current events in East Asia. As many of you here are no doubt aware, there have been a number of interesting and potentially dangerous events on the Korean Peninsula as North Korea moves to restart its nuclear weapons program, or at least that seems to be the appearance of what it's been doing in Yongbyon. And this is in defiance of the latest round of agreements in the six-party talks, and also it seems to be a kind of retribution for the United States' failure to remove North Korea from its list of so-called terrorist states. So this is an unfolding story still as we speak, and our speaker just told me that he intends to keep following it, and when the book comes out in paperback, we'll probably have another chapter added to the book. I don't think we can have a better speaker to give us an inside story on what actually is going on in North Korea. Mike Chinoy, you may all recognize as CNN's senior correspondent for the Asia Pacific for many, many years. He was with the network for 24 years. He was CNN's first bureau chief in Beijing for 8 years. He also served in the bureau in Hong Kong. He is well known for his coverage of Tiananmen Square. In fact, he won several prestigious awards for that coverage, including an Emmy and the prestigious Peabody Award. And he's also written on China. He wrote a book called China Live, People Power and the Television Revolution. Since 1989, he has made an astonishing 14 visits to North Korea as a correspondent, and one of those visits was as the sole correspondent accompanying former President Jimmy Carter to Pyongyang in 1994 to try and broker a solution to the so-called first nuclear crisis. I'm not sure which one we're at right now. I think we're beyond the second, into the third or fourth. As a result of his experiences, he has taken a position as a policy expert. He's the Edgerton Fellow in Korea's Security at the Pacific Council in International Policy in Los Angeles. And he's here to talk to us today about a book that is literally hot off the presses from St. Martin's Press. It just hit the stands in August, called Meltdown, the story of the North Korean nuclear crisis. We'll follow what I'm told is the standard format for Strauss Center talks, about a half an hour of remarks from Mr. Chinoy. Then we'll have another half hour or so for questions from the floor, and then we'll give you an opportunity to purchase this book, which I'm sure you'll be eager to get at a discount from our table here up at the front. So please join me in welcoming Mike Chinoy to the LBJ School.
Thanks very much. I'm pleased to be here. This is certainly the best catered talk that I have encountered on my book tour so far. And thank you all for coming. You're right. It is an interesting time to be talking about North Korea because, unfortunately, I think we're beginning to see the possible start of what I guess would be the third major North Korean nuclear crisis. One in the mid-90s that you mentioned, the second one, which I chronicle in this book, and possibly now the third one. I'll get to the current situation in a bit, but I wanted to begin by actually telling you about my lunch with the father of North Korea's current leader, Kim Jong-il, the man they call the great leader, Kim Il-sung. And hopefully we can get this working right. Yes, there we are. That's Kim Il-sung on the right, and that's me, and that was a long time ago, and I'm much older, and he's dead. But I actually met him 3 times. And the lunch happened on the second meeting. The first meeting was in 1992 when I accompanied the Reverend Billy Graham to North Korea, which was a fascinating experience in and of itself. The second meeting was in April 1994, and then the third meeting was when I accompanied former President Carter 2 months later. In any case, I was part of a group that had spent 90 minutes talking with Kim at the Kumsungsang Palace, which was this massive marbled monstrosity with 100-foot-high ceilings, everything aligned in perfect symmetry, not a speck of dust or dirt in sight anywhere. And we ate lunch in this room with a gorgeous view of the mountains behind. And before we began, the great leader, as the North Koreans called him, stood up to give a toast. And as he did so, the rays of the sun seemed to pour through the window, bathing Kim in this kind of golden glow. And as he sat down, the glow appeared to fade, and we then went on with lunch, and it was a very interesting experience. He talked about how he wanted a negotiated solution to the nuclear crisis that was then brewing with the United States. He also had some wonderful tales to tell. He said, for example, that he liked to hunt bears, but he was getting old, and so his soldiers, out of consideration for his age, would take a bear and stick it in a tree and give him a rifle, and then he could take a shot so he could still indulge his passion for hunting bears. Anyway, as we left, my cameraman, my CNN cameraman who notices such things, leaned over to me in amazement and said, "Did you see the lights?" I said, "No, what are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, when Kim got up to make that toast, rows of tiny reddish-colored lights that had been installed at the point where the wall and the ceiling intersect, evidently he'd spotted, somebody had cranked them up to create this rosy glow, and it was a completely artificial device and not the rays of the sun that had created this impression of this aura surrounding the great leader." And to me, that episode really underscores the fact that when you're dealing with North Korea, you can never be sure just what is real and what's not. It's really one of the big challenges. I do have to say, though, that given the amount of spin I encountered among the rival factions in the Bush administration, I often had a similar sensation on my many visits to Washington to research this book, trying to decipher what was real and what was not. Anyway, with that caveat, let me talk a little bit about the book and where things stand with North Korea today. Meltdown is a work of investigative reporting. I spent nearly 2 years and interviewed over 200 people, some of them not once, but many times, people ranging from Colin Powell to John Bolton to the former president of South Korea to dozens and dozens of others, in the hope of piecing together the story of the North Korean nuclear crisis. I came into it with no preconceived notions, no axe to grind, no particular agenda, except as a longtime reporter who had covered the story for many years as a correspondent in Asia, to try and get the story right, because it is a pretty amazing story. How North Korea staged its nuclear breakout, how a U.S. administration whose top priority was to prevent so-called rogue states from acquiring weapons of mass destruction was not able to stop Kim Jong-il's regime from doing just that. Why and how the Bush administration abruptly reversed course from confrontation to negotiation. And what this tells us about the making of foreign policy in the Bush administration, and also about how the North Korean leadership and political system operates. I want to talk about some of the key headlines in the book, because I think they'll help shed some light both on the general environment in which U.S. policy toward North Korea has been made and on what's happening today. Meltdown documents in more detail than has previously been available how fierce bureaucratic infighting left the Bush administration with a policy toward North Korea that was incoherent, dysfunctional, and often self-defeating. These battles between hardliners like Vice President Cheney and John Bolton, who was the ambassador to the UN, and others who opposed real negotiations with North Korea, and those who favored a diplomatic approach like Colin Powell, Assistant Secretary, and Powell seen here with Richard Armitage, his deputy, with President Bush, Condoleezza Rice, the current Assistant Secretary of State, Christopher Hill, and others, shape almost every development that I cover in Meltdown. And it produced episodes that would be comical if the stakes weren't so high. For example, Vice President Cheney personally intervening with President Bush to overrule Colin Powell's instructions to his negotiator at the six-party talks in Beijing in ways that the North Koreans were certain to reject, a development that could have jeopardized the entire six-party process. Powell and his deputy Armitage keeping to themselves and not sharing with other senior officials news delivered by North Korean diplomats to State Department officials that Pyongyang had begun reprocessing plutonium. Hardliners disparagingly calling the State Department's Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs EAPsers, and mocking Assistant Secretary of State Christopher Hill as Kim Jong-il. So this was the climate in which the Bush administration tried to forge a policy on North Korea, and it provides the context for the book's next headline. Meltdown details just how the stunning turnaround in the Bush administration's policy towards North Korea in the past couple of years took place. It shows how Assistant Secretary of State Christopher Hill seized control of the policy process, first by violating instructions from his boss, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, and holding unauthorized bilateral meetings with the North Koreans. And then, after winning Rice over to his side, by freezing out hardline opponents of engagement. As Hill negotiated with the North Koreans, he and Rice simply kept their bureaucratic rivals in the dark, not informing them in advance of key meetings and presenting agreements only after they'd been reached and Rice had convinced President Bush to go along. The normal interagency process in the government, preparing position papers, drafting talking points, circulating them through the bureaucracy, didn't happen. As one source described it to me, the policy process became Hill calls Rice and Rice calls Bush. Given the intense opposition among the hardliners to any deal with North Korea, this was probably the only way that Christopher Hill could have achieved the diplomatic breakthroughs that he did. But it's left him politically isolated and without a lot of friends and allies in Washington as the negotiating process reaches a critical stage, as has now happened. Meltdown also reveals that the nuclear crisis which erupted in 2002 and which led directly to North Korea testing a nuclear bomb and becoming the world's 8th declared nuclear power might have been avoidable and was to a considerable degree provoked by administration hardliners who spun intelligence about a procurement effort for a uranium program into claims of a full-fledged production capability to make a uranium-based nuclear bomb that did not then and does not now exist. The conventionally accepted narrative is that the U.S. uncovered a clandestine North Korean uranium enrichment program, that Assistant Secretary of State James Kelly confronted the North Koreans about it during a visit to Pyongyang in October of 2002, and that they admitted the charge. This led to the U.S. decision to cut off supplies of oil promised to North Korea in late 2002, triggering Pyongyang's decision to restart the Yongbyon reactor, frozen under the 1994 agreed framework deal negotiated by the Clinton administration, and then to stage its subsequent nuclear breakout, culminating in the 2006 nuclear test. Meltdown shows that in the spring and summer of 2002, U.S. intelligence did discover a North Korean effort to procure the components that could be used for uranium enrichment. But the intelligence found only a procurement effort. There was no credible intelligence then, and there hasn't been any credible intelligence since, to show that North Korea had or has an actual uranium enrichment facility that would enable it to make a uranium bomb. This is a really critical distinction. Given the enormous technical challenges involved in assembling a working system of centrifuges that could enrich uranium in sufficient quantities to produce nuclear weapons, the CIA in late 2002 believed it would be mid-decade at the earliest and possibly up to 10 more years before any such plant would be fully operational. The longer time frame meant that the issue, while serious, was not an immediate threat, and it might have been possible to negotiate a resolution to the matter without sparking a new crisis on the Korean Peninsula, had the Bush administration been willing to negotiate at the time. However, administration hardliners who were intent on killing the agreed framework, which they viewed as appeasement by the wimpish Clinton administration, seized on the issue to force a confrontation. After Vice President Cheney intervened directly with President Bush, the original talking points for Assistant Secretary of State Kelly for that trip in October 2002 were overruled, and he was given instructions for his trip not to negotiate. Instead, his instructions dictated that he simply tell the North Koreans they had to abandon their uranium program before any progress on any other issue was possible. He was also ordered not to observe normal diplomatic courtesies, such as holding a reciprocal banquet for his North Korean hosts, or even making a toast at a meal they hosted for him upon his arrival. Although at the time, Kelly and the other members of his delegation came away convinced that North Korea's first vice foreign minister, Kang Suk-ju, had admitted the uranium allegation. Interviews with many members of Kelly's group, plus with others who later saw the transcript, raised serious doubts about whether in fact the North Koreans did make that admission. The actual language was much more ambiguous, talking about North Korea's right to have such weapons, but not saying explicitly that they had them. I should point out that the Bush administration continues to refuse to declassify the transcript of that meeting, despite repeated requests under the Freedom of Information Act. In the book, I also note that the North Koreans at the same meeting did offer to negotiate a solution to the controversy, but it was an offer that Kelly was under instructions to reject. A secret message from Kim Jong-il to President Bush sent the following month through 2 American intermediaries, which also urged talks, was ignored by Washington. Finally, Meltdown highlights some key aspects of North Korean behavior. There's a conventional view that Kim Jong-il, the North Korean leader, is crazy and irrational, someone who's impossible to deal with. The reality, based on interviews with a number of people who had met and negotiated with Kim over the years, including former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and South Korea's former President Kim Dae-jung, is rather different. Kim Jong-il is invariably described as smart, shrewd, well-briefed, very much in charge, and throughout the crisis has a clear strategic goal, which is survival. Let me share one anecdote that I think is really revealing about the North Korean mindset. On one of my visits, I was taken to the mausoleum that houses the embalmed remains of the great leader Kim Il-sung, who died in 1994. And when you visit, you join this vast throng of somber-faced North Koreans, and you glide across a moving walkway that runs for almost a kilometer until you reach a series of vast marble corridors. These lead to a giant chamber with a big white marble statue of the great leader illuminated from behind by pink lights to give the effect of the rosy glow of dawn. They love this rosy glow effect in North Korea for some reason. Anyway, you go then up a set of stairs into a cavernous room where Kim Il-sung's remains are under a glass sort of sarcophagus. He's covered with a flag from the chest down. He looks curiously shrunken. And after you pay your respects, you follow the faithful down a set of stairs to a number of other rooms. In one room, the North Koreans have somehow managed to install Kim Il-sung's favorite train carriage, because like his son, he didn't like to fly, and a bulletproof Mercedes given as a gift to his father by Kim Jong-il. And then you get to the final stop, which is the point of this story. It's an exhibition containing some of the 140,000 gifts the great leader received from foreign dignitaries in his lifetime. Among the items on display were a big belt of merit order from the Polish People's Republic, the Order of Freedom First Class from the People's Socialist Republic of Albania, a medal from the Lenin Centenary of the Soviet Union, and the Karl Marx Order from East Germany. And what's striking is how many of these gifts came from states that no longer existed, and from communist leaders like Romania's Nicolae Ceausescu or East Germany's Erich Honecker, Albania's Enver Hoxha, who had been toppled and tossed, in the old communist phrase, onto the dustbin of history. They were all Kim Il-sung's contemporaries. He outlived them all, and his system, for all its weirdness, has outlasted theirs. And now, in the post-Cold War world, deprived of its long-time alliances with the Soviet Union and China, regime survival, keeping the system intact in a hostile world, has become the all-consuming priority of the North Korean leadership. And understanding this issue from Pyongyang's point of view, I believe, is the key to making sense of North Korean behavior today. In North Korean eyes, the key to survival at a time when almost all the world's other communist states have collapsed is the United States. Pyongyang believes that only the U.S., its longtime enemy, now the world's only superpower, can provide the security guarantees to ensure that North Korea doesn't follow its former communist comrades into oblivion. In the same vein, the North Koreans believe the U.S. holds the key to the international community, to recognition, trade, and aid that might pull the country out of its economic decline and ensure its long-term viability. So that, in my view, is the heart of North Korea's international strategy, and you can see it very clearly on the nuclear issue. Many have seen North Korea's move to develop a nuclear capability as the latest step by a wacky and irrational regime. But a much more plausible explanation, in my view, is that North Korea sees nukes as the only way to ensure its security against a hostile U.S., and that they might, for the right price, real security guarantees from Washington, the lifting of sanctions, economic aid, diplomatic recognition, be coaxed into abandoning them. Moreover, when treated with respect in a genuine negotiating process of give and take, which, incidentally, they repeatedly appealed for from the moment George W. Bush took office, the record shows the North Koreans have been open to resolving their differences with the U.S. through negotiations. Even at moments of extreme tension, as I document in Meltdown, the North Koreans have consistently signaled their desire for talks, and here is one example. It was largely ignored at the time, but in their official statement announcing their nuclear test, when they actually tested a bomb in October of 2006, the North Koreans declared that Pyongyang said it still remains unchanged in its will to denuclearize the peninsula through dialogue and negotiation. The DPRK, which is Democratic People's Republic of Korea, is ready for both dialogue and confrontation. Moreover, despite their reputation as difficult negotiators, it took only 2 months at the six-party talks in Beijing to agree on what's called the September 19th Declaration that was signed in September of 2005, laying out a set of principles for resolving the crisis. This is Assistant Secretary of State Christopher Hill shaking hands with his North Korean counterpart on the right, and you can see he's wearing a little button with a picture of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, which almost all North Koreans wear, and they're essentially obliged to wear it or else they'll get into trouble. And that's South Korea's envoy in the middle. And it took about the same amount of time, just a couple of months, to reach a deal in February of 2007 which spelled out a detailed roadmap for denuclearization and paved the way for the shutdown of the Yongbyon reactor. Critics argue that the North Koreans are not sincere, that they don't keep their agreements that they've signed up to. I would say that skepticism is certainly in order, but because of the frequent flip-flopping and the mixed signals coming from Washington, the situation has never reached a point where the North's ultimate intentions could be truly tested. One thing, however, is abundantly clear. The experience of the last 7 years does show that pressure and coercion don't work with North Korea. Instead, the predictable North Korean response when pushed has been to push back even harder, to make clear it won't knuckle under whatever the cost. All in all, it's a pretty dramatic tale, and I found in my research for my book that there was also a fascinating spy underworld aspect to it, from the story of the Banco Delta Asia, the Macau bank where the North Koreans supposedly ran a money laundering and counterfeiting operation, to the murder of a North Korean agent in Pakistan just days after Pakistan's own nuclear test, the role of the rogue Pakistani nuclear scientist A.Q. Khan, to the role of a South Korean spy in North Korea. But you'll have to find the book to get all those you have to buy the book to get all those juicy details. Anyway, that brings me to what's happening today. I mentioned the February 13th, 2007 deal. Since then, and following another more detailed agreement reached on October 3rd last year, there have been some important steps forward. In return for shipments of heavy fuel and other aid, and the prospect of a political thaw with the U.S., the North Koreans shut down the Yongbyon reactor. They admitted U.S. and international inspectors, including Assistant Secretary of State Christopher Hill, seen here visiting the Yongbyon site wearing protective clothing. And they took a series of steps to disable the facility. This development was symbolized by the televised destruction of the cooling tower at Yongbyon in late June. The North also gave the U.S. thousands of pages of documentation, including the reactor's operating records. And in late June, it provided a 60-page declaration of its nuclear capabilities. The declaration did not, however, address the issue of North Korea's uranium efforts or its possible nuclear cooperation with Syria, even though the terms of the agreement reached in 2007 called for Pyongyang to provide a complete and correct declaration. Under the deal, in return for disabling in the declaration, the U.S. was supposed to lift sanctions under the Trading with the Enemy Act and begin the process of removing Pyongyang from its list of state sponsors of terrorism. Despite its shortcomings, the U.S. and the other participants in the six-party talks accepted the declaration, and almost immediately afterwards, in late June, President Bush announced plans to take the North Koreans off the terrorism list. But now, barely 3 months later, the North Koreans have announced they're restarting operations at Yongbyon. We're facing a potentially major new crisis. So what's going on? The conventional narrative is that this is yet another example of North Korea reneging on its commitments. The reality, however, is rather different. While the Bush administration and the other members of the six-party talks accepted the North Korean declaration, there was pushback in Washington from critics, most notably Vice President Cheney's office, former UN Ambassador John Bolton, a leading hardline voice, and others, who claimed that the failure of the declaration to address the uranium and Syria issues showed that it wasn't credible. They accused Christopher Hill of giving away too much to the North Koreans, and they insisted that the U.S. demand that the North accept a detailed protocol to verify the declaration before the delisting would actually be implemented. Under this pressure, President Bush and Secretary of State Rice announced that despite the president's decision in late June that he was moving to take the North Koreans off the terrorism list, that step would not actually be implemented until the North accepted the details of a verification regime. The North Koreans, when this happened, were furious. In a statement in late August, the North pointed to the fact that the agreement on the declaration, there was no language explicitly making acceptance of a verification protocol a condition for delisting. That's a quote from the North Korean Foreign Ministry. And senior administration officials have acknowledged to me privately that technically the North Koreans are right when they say that by refusing to delist, it's the U.S. that's reneging on the commitment, because there is in fact no explicit language talking about the need for a detailed protocol to verify the declaration as a precondition for delisting. My understanding from those who've spoken directly with senior North Korean officials is that Pyongyang hasn't rejected a deal on verification altogether. It's the sequencing that's the issue. The North says verification is supposed to be dealt with in the next round of negotiations that would begin after it's been removed from the terrorism list. So what the Bush administration, or elements in the Bush administration, see as a step to ensure the truth of what the North has told them in the declaration is seen in Pyongyang as the United States unilaterally moving the goalposts and trying to squeeze additional concessions by threatening not to go ahead with delisting. Before I conclude by talking about where this leaves things today, let me go back over the backstory of what happened with the uranium and Syria and verification to lead us to this potentially dangerous point. When the U.S. pushed the North Koreans to come clean on what they may or may not have done with the uranium program earlier in the year, they balked. This created a dilemma for the U.S. negotiator, Christopher Hill. If he had insisted on a full accounting of uranium, the process might have collapsed without the North Koreans providing information on its plutonium program, which was the most immediate threat to U.S. security. After all, the North Koreans had already manufactured enough weapons-grade plutonium at that Yongbyon reactor to make anywhere from 6 to 10 bombs and had staged a nuclear test. That was the immediate threat. In contrast, while getting to the bottom of what may or may not have happened with uranium was a serious concern, the reality is that the U.S. has no credible intelligence, as I mentioned earlier, that North Korea has ever had a production-level capability to enrich uranium. As I mentioned, in 2002, the intelligence that sparked this whole crisis was about a procurement effort. The North Koreans trying to acquire the bits and pieces to make such a facility, but there's no evidence they actually succeeded in doing so, and it appears that at best they're years away from actually being able to make a uranium bomb if they have that capability at all. On the issue of Syria, there is a similar dilemma. The Syria question came to public attention when Israel destroyed a site in the Syrian desert in September 2007, where Damascus was allegedly building a nuclear reactor with North Korean help. This is a satellite picture taken of this site in August of 2007. You can see in the square facility in the middle. Indeed, if the North was helping Damascus to build a nuclear reactor modeled on Yongbyon, that is very worrying. But in any event, in September of 2007, the Israelis leveled whatever it was the Syrians were building, where, by the way, there's no evidence that the North was making any fissile material, stuff you can actually put into bombs, but it appears to have been more assistance in terms of constructing the building. So the site and the immediate threat that it posed no longer existed. So as with the uranium issue, again, Christopher Hill faced a choice. Do you risk jeopardizing real progress on the immediate threat, which is your plutonium at the Yongbyon reactor, by demanding a North Korean confession about a project the Israelis had destroyed? Or do you try and find some compromise that would keep the process of disabling Yongbyon going and hope to try and get to the bottom of the uranium and Syria issues at a later stage of the negotiations? In both cases, Hill chose to avoid a confrontation in the hope of keeping this disabling process moving forward. The deal he reached with the North Koreans was that in side documents to the main declaration of their nuclear capabilities, the North Koreans would, quote, acknowledge what they had been told by Washington about uranium and Syria. The clear understanding was that the U.S. would press for more details going forward, but Hill argued it was a mistake to allow these two less immediate concerns to block movement towards getting North Korea out of the plutonium business now. Once Pyongyang provided the declaration, it was supposed to be taken off the terrorism list. The disabling of the Yongbyon reactor would then be completed, assuring the North could not resume making plutonium for at least a year, and denying it the leverage that would come from threatening to do so. Talks would then address plans for verification as a first step to the dismantling of all the North's nuclear programs. But this deal, which President Bush and Secretary of State Rice went along with early in the summer, meant that the declaration the North provided was not, as the agreement called for, complete and correct. And as I mentioned, in Washington, the hardliners said it wasn't credible and it gave away too much. The conservative hardline pushback became so intense that Bush and Rice buckled, and as I mentioned, they made the demand for accepting the verification protocol a precondition for following through with delisting. So predictably, the North Koreans have gone to their tried and true playbook, and pushed back by taking steps to restart the reactor. And now we have the rumors about Kim Jong-il's health. The truth is that no one outside North Korea's inner circle really knows what's happening, but it appears that at some point in the middle of August he had a stroke. He may be on the mend, but nobody is really sure in what kind of shape he's in. Whatever shape he's in, this new development has had one profound consequence, because it means the issue of the succession in North Korea is now in play, and there's very little clarity about how that might unfold. By the time his own father was 66, which is Kim Jong-il's current age, the younger Kim had been the designated heir for a half dozen years. But from the publicly available evidence, none of Kim Jong-il's three sons from two different women, who would be the obvious logical choices for a successor, have been put forward as his heirs. All three of the sons have some political question marks. The older one was detained by Japanese immigration officials at Tokyo airport, traveling on a fake Dominican Republic passport, and told the Japanese he was trying to visit Tokyo Disneyland. One of the two younger ones was, very little is known about the two younger ones. One of them was reportedly spotted at an Eric Clapton concert somewhere in Europe, but we know nothing about them, and in any case they haven't been put forward in the North Korean media. The propaganda machine doesn't talk about them. None of the groundwork has been laid for them to continue this unusual family dynasty. So no one is sure what's going to happen. Some have predicted a North Korean collapse if Kim Jong-il leaves the scene. I'm actually not so sure. My guess is that if he did die, the military would take over and rule in his name. I don't think we would see an earlier catastrophic collapse of the North Korean system, although Pyongyang might well become much more difficult to deal with in its negotiations on the nuclear issue. I should note that, as best I can tell, the North's moves in relation to this controversy over the delisting, restarting the reactor, preceded Kim's illness and are consistent with its past behavior, but its current attitude may well be influenced by the fact that there is some uncertainty about the leadership. And given all the stresses in North Korea internally, it's impossible to predict the future course of events with much confidence. Often lost in this exceptionally complicated picture is the big picture. As I've noted, for years what the North Koreans have wanted is an end to their conflict with the U.S. in order to ensure the survival of the current leadership and system. Until Pyongyang is convinced that's going to happen, from a North Korean perspective, holding on to its bombs has a certain logic. Given the lack of trust between Washington and Pyongyang, and the way, as I mentioned here in Chronicle in greater and much more colorful detail in Meltdown, it's become much worse since George W. Bush took office. It would frankly be unrealistic to expect the North to take the dramatic step of giving up what it sees as the key to its survival without a correspondingly dramatic series of gestures from the United States. Many analysts are doubtful that the North would ever willingly abandon its nukes. I think that's a legitimate concern. Moreover, if Kim Jong-il is incapacitated or if he dies, the odds of the regime taking such a step are even smaller. No way are they going to consider taking such a step in the near future. Maybe if a U.S. president visits Pyongyang, Air Force One arrives at Pyongyang Airport, the president opens an American embassy there and lifts all the sanctions, it might become a possibility, but probably not before. Long, difficult negotiations and many confidence-building measures will be required, even under the best of circumstances. And unfortunately, we don't really have the best of circumstances. with a nuclear arsenal developed and expanded in large part in response to what he saw as the Bush administration's efforts to do him in, Kim Jong-il has much more to give up now. Unfortunately, North Korea is in a position to demand a much higher price from the United States for any future moves towards denuclearization than would have been the case had the Bush administration chosen the path of negotiations at the start. And if the administration sticks to its guns and can't find a compromise to get around this issue of taking the North off the terrorism list, the North will carry on with starting up the reactor, and just after a new president takes office, they could be in a position to have their nuclear program up and running again. It could be the first big international crisis for President McCain or President Obama. And it will be a crisis where there are few good options, with the likeliest outcome that North Korea, despite its weaknesses, despite the fact that it's facing a deeply uncertain leadership transition, may well, for a good long while yet, get away with becoming and remaining the world's 8th declared nuclear power. So I'll stop there and happy to take questions and discussion. Thanks very much. Questions, comments? Do you want me to sit? I can do it myself. Do you want me to sit down or stand up? Does it matter?
Feel free to sit down.
Okay, I will sit down and drink my Starbucks. Yes.
Okay. My name is Amanda. I'm a student here at the LBJ School. And often we look at case studies from history to try and derive lessons for future policy decisions. But I'm wondering, with your experience, is this sort of an anomaly? Are there really any lessons with maybe how to deal with potential nuclear power, nuclear threat, or is North Korea really just an anomaly that doesn't really hold any lessons that can carry over to any other?
Actually, maybe I better stand up because you've got your microphone there. I think. You sure? Yeah. And clearly, North Korea has its own idiosyncrasies and unique qualities, but I think there are some lessons. One lesson is that an ideologically driven foreign policy, however emotionally satisfying, all too often doesn't work. You can understand the impulse behind the views of the hardliners. The North Korean system is a horrible one. The plight of its people is terrible. It's got a leadership with the most extreme personality cult of modern times. But just because it's horrible you can't wish it away. And I think one of the lessons here is that an attempt to confront North Korea, unless you're prepared to go as far as it takes, becomes counterproductive. One critic that I interviewed for this book described the views of the hardliners, and to the extent that it dominated the administration's approach to North Korea for the first half dozen years that the president's been in office, as an attitude rather than a policy. With North Korea, you're dealing with a regime that let nearly 2 million of its own citizens starve to death in the late 1990s. So if you don't let them import color TV sets or luxury items or sanction them in other areas, there's no evidence that that's going to produce a leadership change. There was a wonderful quote at the height of pushing for sanctions when they announced that I think they were going to ban shipments of Hennessy cognac or something, and some columnist wrote that unless they use Hennessy cognac to fuel their missiles, the sanctions aren't going to have much effect. And that leads to the second point, which is, and this is a pattern that you've seen you see it now with Iran, and it was in the early days of the Clinton administration a pattern that we saw in the first nuclear crisis, which is the debate over should you negotiate with bad guys, and there's a famous quote attributed to Vice President Cheney: "We don't negotiate with evil, we defeat it." Well, the reality is refusing to negotiate in the case of North Korea did not defeat the threat from North Korea. It simply made the North Koreans more determined than ever to acquire a nuclear capability. And now, because it took them so long to get around to negotiating, the program they're trying to roll back, which in 2001 may have consisted of enough weapons-grade plutonium for 1 or 2 bombs, now may have enough for 6 or 10, They've staged a test. They've told their own people they're a nuclear power. It's going to be a lot harder to roll it back. There is this tendency to make negotiation on the part of the Bush administration and the early Clinton administration to make negotiations seem like a concession rather than the tool to extract concessions. So I think another lesson is that serious diplomacy is worth a try, partly because you might get somewhere, partly because if you fail to get somewhere, you'll have a much better chance of rallying the international community and your friends and allies to take tougher steps. I think it was very evident in the case of North Korea that when Washington really wanted to get tough, no matter how irritated the South Koreans, the Chinese, the Russians were with what the North Koreans were doing, they weren't going to buy into a confrontation. They're in the neighborhood. They would take the fallout from implosion, collapse, war, instability. And so nobody was on board with that. Had the U.S. made a really serious good faith effort to address North Korea's concerns in a real horse trading bargain, and had the North Koreans rejected that, you'd have a much stronger case that negotiations didn't work. So I would say an ideologically driven foreign policy doesn't work. Refusing to at least try to negotiate with your adversaries doesn't work, and it makes it much more difficult to rally international support for tougher actions if you haven't tried that first. Yes?
If the number one motivator of the North Korean regime is maintenance of the regime, then the steps that they take slowly building up a crisis are steps that are designed to draw attention, designed to force people into negotiations. The threat from North Korea then, in some ways, is self-limiting. The North Koreans are not going to carry out a suicidal strike against the United States if the regime wants to preserve itself. So when North Korea tests a nuclear weapon, they pretty much played their last card shy of sharing nuclear bombs with other countries, which is going to bring the wrath of the Chinese on them as well, the Russians possibly, and others involved, and leave them entirely without any allies. Instead, it seems that their policy is to try to find ways to constantly play between the fears of other people to build up their own, to preserve themselves, because they can get the Japanese to give them something, get the South Koreans sometimes, get the U.S. sometimes, the Chinese and play it around. So is it and I don't necessarily agree with the policy that the administration had, but is it a dumb policy to try to ignore the North Koreans into submission, which is in some ways what the first 6 years were? They weren't confrontational. We weren't loading airplanes over there. We weren't flying bombers over them. We were simply ignoring them to death. It's like treating them like a kid in the candy store who says, "I'll hold my breath until you give me candy." Well, he'll let him hold his breath until he passes out. So when we look at he's going to breathe again. If we look at the administration policy, like I said, I don't necessarily agree with it, but can we assess it as saying, well, this is dumb, they should have done negotiations because that worked for Clinton part of the way through? Or can we say, well, maybe there is something behind this policy in that the negotiations perpetuate in some ways the North Korean behavior of, okay, we're going to try to keep building up, slow down, build up, so that.
It's a good question. And certainly there were people in the Clinton administration who argued, as the North took one step after another, that this wasn't a crisis, we're not going to be drawn. The irony was, as the U.S. kept saying this about North Korea, the Bush administration, it was creating a huge crisis over a danger from Iraq that, in practical terms, Saddam Hussein had nothing, and the North Koreans actually had a program. So there's an issue of consistency. But I think there's some other. First of all, there was some muscle flexing, particularly in 2003, and that's early 2003, and that's one of the reasons why the Chinese, as I documented in Meltdown, one of the reasons why the Chinese got involved is that they were very scared with the successful toppling of Saddam Hussein that there would be some push to have a go at Kim Jong-il. There's a second issue, which is, what does it do to the whole international regime of trying to control the spread of nuclear weapons if a state goes from a frozen program and a modest amount of plutonium to a restarted program, manufacturing plutonium, making bombs, testing bombs, doesn't that erode even more what little is left of the international non-proliferation regime? The third thing is that you're right, if it were just the U.S. and North Korea, but the North Koreans taking these steps could conceivably, if not reversed, have a very dangerous domino effect in the region. You had talk after the nuclear test in Japan about whether the Japanese needed to consider going nuclear themselves, and that was really quieted only when Secretary of State Rice went to Japan and said, don't worry, our alliance with you is rock solid, you're under our nuclear umbrella. But if there were movement on that front in Japan, the Chinese, who see the Japanese as their strategic rivals in Northeast Asia, there could have all kinds of consequences. So there's a kind of a nuclear domino effect. And it's, I mean, the North Koreans could stage another test. That raises all sorts of tensions. I think the North Koreans realize that if they gave fissile material to bad guys, that could really be the end. And I think they have made it pretty clear that's not, they don't intend to do that. On the other hand, if they really felt trapped and cornered, it's not impossible. I once, in '94, I think I was on a visit to North Korea, and the North Koreans said to another colleague, don't force us to commit suicide, which is an interesting mindset. So I think the track record has shown that if you're trying to discourage states from getting nuclear weapons, I mean, the flip side of looking at it that way is comparing where North Korea is at vis-a-vis the U.S. as compared to Iraq. North Korean counter-argument is, we did this and they didn't attack us, and Saddam didn't and he got whacked. So, and now when you get involved in negotiations, it's much harder to roll it back. And if they keep doing it, a North Korea that has 50 bombs, given the potential for instability, for conflict, is a more worrying thing than a North Korea that's got 8 bombs, which is a more worrying thing that it's got 2. Anyone else? Yes. Ladies first.
You mentioned a mischaracterization of whether Kim Jong-il is a rational or an irrational player. Does the media play a role in that at all? Would you like to comment on the mainstream media's role in that?
Good question, and I think absolutely the media plays a role for a couple of different reasons. As I say, there is a kind of conventional narrative about North Korea, that it's this whacked out leadership, this really weird, crazy place. Clearly there are some elements of that. I mean, this is, it's a very strange system. I think one of the problems is there's so little information. One of the problems is that the coverage, there are very few people in the mainstream media who are as consumed with the minutiae of the North Korean issue as the few eccentrics like me and a handful of others who just really focus on it in great detail all the time. If any of you were able to follow what I said, you will see how incredibly complicated it is. And if you are writing for the Associated Press or CNN or you name it, you've got daily deadlines, you've got 800 words, you've got 1 minute and 45 seconds. You're not, and today you're doing North Korea, and tomorrow you're doing the Russian attack on Georgia, and the next day you're doing the Middle East peace process, and the following day you're doing Afghanistan, and the next day you're doing Iraq. It's almost impossible by definition to get beyond that. Moreover, particularly in Washington, where people are spinning like crazy, the people you talk to tend to sort of buy into certain narratives. And so I think it takes a kind of conscious effort of will to resist that, to take one step back, to try and fit this in a bigger picture. And the issue of this delisting is an absolutely classic case in point, because most of the media coverage, until just in the last few days, most of the media coverage has completely reflected the prevailing line of the administration, which is the North Koreans are flagrantly violating their commitments. The reality, as I've tried to indicate, is that it's much more murky, and you can make a plausible case that to some degree it's the U.S. reneging on its commitments that's triggered this scary North Korean response and not the other way around. And there was an editorial the other day in the New York Times about this. Last Friday, Glenn Kessler of the Washington Post had an absolutely fascinating piece detailing the internal dynamics in the summer about verification that buttresses this argument, which I would urge you all to read if you're interested. It's absolutely fascinating. But he's one of the few people who has really followed this in great detail. So I think the media does contribute to this kind of caricature, stereotypical view that hinders understanding as much as adds to it. Yes, I'm sorry.
Is there any evidence, though, in the past 50 years that negotiation has been successful with this or the previous?
Yeah, I think it depends how you define success, but I think the answer is yes.
Okay, what concessions have we got?
Well, in 1994, the agreed framework put a halt to operations at the Yongbyon reactor at a time when the North may have had enough weapons-grade plutonium for 1 or 2 bombs. That not happened. By the time they restarted the reactor in 2003, they could have had enough plutonium for 70, 50, 75, 100 bombs. So that agreement prevented the North from having a much larger and potentially more dangerous nuclear arsenal. So I think that's one agreement. There have been a number of minor agreements. There was a period of a number of years when the North Koreans allowed the U.S. military to send people to look at sites for MIAs. There are lots of problems with it, but the point is that a mechanism existed where that could be addressed. The agreements in the last, there was an agreement in 1998. The U.S. intelligence identified a suspect site in a place called Kumchang-ni, which they thought was going to be an underground site for a nuclear reactor, and there were difficult negotiations, but in the end, the North Koreans agreed for a very modest fee of shipments of food, a very modest price, to let a team of Americans in to inspect the site. They discovered that the whatever the spy satellites picked up was wrong, and whatever it was, it had nothing to do with the nuclear program. But again, it was a case of access that was arranged. And the 2 agreements that were reached last year, once those agreements came into force, the North Koreans ceased operations at Yongbyon in July of 2007. They readmitted the IAEA and American inspectors. They took a number of steps to begin the process of disabling it, and so until now, a site that was producing weapons-grade plutonium pretty consistently from early 2003 until mid-2007 ceased to do so. So I wouldn't argue for a minute that it's easy. I certainly accept that one shouldn't trust the North Koreans further than you could throw them, that there are lots and lots of problems, but I think the track record is that it is not impossible to do business with them. And given the alternatives, which are all pretty bad, and this is one of the problems for any policymaker, you look at what's out there, there's no good choices. Dealing with them is horrible, because if you give them goodies to get them to roll back their nuclear program, you're propping up an odious regime. Having no deal so that they move ahead and become an even more potent nuclear power is a bad deal. The military option is a terrible deal. The if you look at the map, the South Korean capital is a 45-minute drive from the demilitarized zone, and the North Koreans have 10,000, 15,000 artillery tubes within easy range of Seoul. So any military strike, even if you could identify where they actually kept their bombs, which is certainly not at the place where they made the weapons-grade plutonium, so wiping out Yongbyon wouldn't do that much good. But it would certainly precipitate, conceivably, the destruction of the South Korean capital. They have missiles, medium-range missiles that could reach targets in Japan. They have a long-range missile that might or might not reach targets in the continental U.S. So and with Iraq and Afghanistan and the economic meltdown, the last thing that the United States needs is a new Korean War. So they're all bad options. And I would argue that until it is incontrovertibly proved that you can get nowhere, that pursuing the path of negotiations is the least bad option under the circumstances. The others might conceivably have to, make their way onto the agenda, but I'm convinced that the North Koreans ultimately want a deal. That all of this behavior is designed to get a deal without being perceived to be operating from a position of weakness, because their fear is if the U.S. thinks they're weak, they'll just whack them the way they did Iraq and so on. But one of the things about Kim Jong-il and his father was I think they really did want a deal, an accommodation with the U.S. One of the question marks, if he leaves the scene, is whether or not whoever follows him will still have that grand strategic goal. And if that changes, we could be in for real problems. But the bottom line is, I think, uneven, but it's not a completely negative track record. Yes?
You said that the one thing North Korea needs is like a security guarantee with the United States to ensure they're surviving. But I was actually kind of wondering about the current position of China and to what extent will their influence increase. I mean, as their influence, I guess, rises in Asia, to what extent will that guarantee from the United States continue to become less relevant?
Well, it's an interesting question. The North Koreans see the U.S. as their main adversary, but it's interesting. People who've had conversations, sort of wide-ranging conversations with North Korean officials, and even some people who talk to Kim Jong-il, have come away with the impression that this is the immediate adversarial relationship, but that in the broader strategic sense, North Korea is a small country. It's surrounded by big neighbors, China, Japan, Russia, with whom it has not always had a happy history. Everybody thinks there's this perception of China as North Korea's great friend and ally, and certainly the Chinese were ideological partners, particularly in the 50s, and they came to North Korea's aid during the Korean War, but that I think was more because of the approach of U.S. forces to the Chinese border than anything else. But the North Koreans don't like the Chinese. I've been really struck on my visits there. They don't like being the little brother to having the Chinese big brother. They don't always follow what the Chinese tell them. And they have indicated to some Americans in conversations that if they could figure out how to have an accommodation with the U.S., they would like that as a bulwark against being too subservient to the Chinese. And in fact, when South Korean President Kim Dae-jung met Kim Jong-il in June 2000, Kim Jong-il indicated he would be open to the idea of American troops remaining in a reunified Korea as a counterweight to the Chinese. It's an interesting idea, and it shows that the North Koreans see this in kind of very big terms. And I think, as I tried to stress earlier, it's important not to lose sight of the broad kind of take of where the North Koreans are coming from. If you get bogged down in the minutiae of this language or that deal, you forget where the bigger picture. And the other thing and from the Chinese point of view, the Chinese have differing interests here. They don't want a nuclear North Korea because, as I mentioned, if it triggers the Japanese to go nuclear or the South Koreans to go nuclear or Taiwan to go nuclear, that's bad news for China. They also don't want a collapse. First of all, they'll be the country that will get all the refugees and all the other blowback from instability. If there were an implosion and chaos and the U.S. or the South Korean military intervene, that's the last thing the Chinese want. So the Chinese are going to urge North Korea and push North Korea, but they are not going to bring that regime to its knees to accommodate American demands. And so what they want is the U.S. and the North Koreans to sit down and haggle and come up with some deal that will keep a process going. And one of the things that Washington has repeatedly tried to do is get the Chinese to lean on the North Koreans. Certainly, if the Chinese wanted to, they've got leverage. Most of the food and fuel, it all comes in through China. But they're not going to strangle North Korea to achieve American objectives at the risk of destabilizing a very important neighbor. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about China as well. Thank you for covering that. And I also want to talk about South Korea specifically, because I know the whole sunshine policy, I don't know, maybe the sun has said a little bit on that. But it seems like you're talking about the U.S. being a little conflicted in the way that they deal with North Korea, the Chinese obviously having a lot of different conflicting concerns, but it seems like the impression I've got is that the South Koreans do as well, because you have the whole West Germany, East Germany sort of situation. They don't want to be left holding the bag when the regime either collapses or when it comes back as part of a unified Korea and they have millions of abject people in abject poverty that they've got to kind of bring up. And I don't know, I get the sense that there is at least some opinion in South Korea that maybe keeping things the way they are, or some modified state of the way things are, may not be such a bad idea.
Well, I think the logic of the sunshine policy was to reduce tensions and over a period of decades help North Korea with a kind of soft landing. Kim Dae-jung, who came up with this term, sunshine policy, once told an American visitor that North Korea is like a mold, and that's why it needs sunshine to dry it out. So he was not naive about this. No, the last thing the South Koreans want is a collapse, because they, along with the Chinese, as you're absolutely right, will be left holding the bag. The new South Korean government has shifted tone somewhat, I think, frankly, in very clumsy ways, and the tensions that have been produced between North and South Korea in recent months are, to a large degree, an own goal by the South Korean government. They just they came in with an attitude, not a policy. We're going to demand more reciprocity in North Korea. We're going to be tougher. They didn't keep any back channel lines open to the North Koreans to say, look, we're saying all this stuff, but don't worry, we'll get back to communicating with you. They made the most important thing they failed to do is they failed to reaffirm agreements that two previous presidents had reached with Kim Jong-il on their visits to Pyongyang. And again, in the North Korean system, where Kim Jong-il is God, and agreements that he reaches with other leaders are holy writ, for another government to come in and essentially blow it off as a very, very bad reaction. I just say parenthetically, there's an episode I write about at the beginning of my book. In October of 2000, Kim Jong-il sent his top military guy, Vice Marshal Jo Myung-ruk, to Washington. It was the most senior North Korean official ever to visit the U.S., and he met President Clinton. And during that visit, the two governments signed a communique in which they agreed that neither government would have, quote, hostile intent toward the other. For the North Koreans, this was an absolutely pivotal moment, and they viewed that communique the way the Chinese view the Shanghai communique that Nixon signed in 1972 as underpinning the whole new relationship. So the Bush administration comes into office. They have a policy review, which every new administration does. It's a bitter bloodbath between engagers and hardliners over what the policy should be towards North Korea, and the hardliners won most of the fights, and one of the battles was, do we reaffirm this communique that the U.S. has no hostile intent? The hardliners said, no, we can't, we shouldn't, it's a concession, the North Koreans want it, we should withhold it. The engagers said that's a bad idea because the North Koreans set great store by it. So they didn't reaffirm it, and as one of the senior State Department people said to me, the people didn't want to reaffirm it because reaffirm that they had no hostile intent, because they did in fact have hostile intent toward North Korea. The North Koreans, these things carry a lot of weight with the North Koreans, and so now you're beginning to see signs that there's some dialogue between the North and the South. But the North was so cheesed off that the South Koreans said, we're not going to give you food aid unless you ask for it. The North Koreans said, we're not going to beg for food, we'll rather go hungry. Of course, the leadership isn't going hungry, the people are going hungry. But even this government recognizes, when you talk to them, that some engagement is really the only way. I mean, there's nobody serious in South Korea that wants to see a confrontation. Now, they all know that some kind of engagement is really the only choice, and the hope is over time. And I think, to be honest, if you look at the changes in communist societies like in Vietnam or in China, it hasn't been mass protests The things that have changed there have been the result of foreign investment and blue jeans and rock and roll and Coca-Cola and students coming to study at the University of Texas and other places and so on. And I think if there was any chance of North Korea evolving, it's going to, and changing in a better direction without all the catastrophic fallout of collapse or implosion, it's going to be through engagement. But it creates a really knotty problem, which is to do that with this government and this system is going to mean holding your nose and making nice with a pretty odious bunch of players. But again, what are the alternatives? But it's a hard sell. The president's going to go on TV and say, you know, we're going to bring these guys down by paying for 1,000 North Koreans to come study business at the University of Texas. It's not going to sell. But I think in the long run, there's more likelihood of possibility of change. And just one other point about collapse, which people forget about. It's very emotionally satisfying to see this regime go down, no question. But the one scenario that in my mind has the most likelihood of leading to North Korean nuclear material, the stuff that you make bombs, getting into the hands of grade A bad guys, is internal collapse or instability in North Korea, civil strife, conflict between rival generals or military factions, where whoever's got the control over the nuclear sites doesn't have it anymore. And that is the one circumstance where I could conceive that a rival faction that's losing needs money to buy weapons for the civil conflict, and so Al-Qaeda gives them $100 million. They get a lump of plutonium like this they can blow up in New York. So again, be careful what you wish for, because it may turn out not to be the outcome that you think.
Kind of like Pakistan.
Yes, the subject of my next book. Yeah.
If you read it, what will Colin Powell think of your vote?
I think he'll think it's fair. One of the things I was saying to Patty before, one of the interesting things since the book came out, none of the major players have challenged the substance of any of the reporting. People can agree or disagree on lots of things, but nobody has come out and said, you know, I was at that meeting and it didn't happen that way. And so I've been gratified that on all the sides, because I tried. I mean, you could clearly see from my comments that I'm critical of the administration, but I didn't come into this to write a book that was critical of the administration. I came into it to recount a story, and I spent a lot of time and effort to talk to everybody on all sides of the issue to get them to agree to let me put their comments on the record, so that when these meetings are recounted, you have the words of the people who were there on all sides of the issue. I think the fact is that when the Bush administration came into office, North Korea had enough plutonium for 1 or 2 bombs, and now it's a declared nuclear power with enough plutonium for 6 or 10. So by any standards, that's a policy failure. But my impression is that pretty much everybody who's involved in it has accepted that the actual recounting of the events is just absolutely straight.
Let's take 1 or 2 more, and then we'll
Then you can all go buy books.
That's right.
Yeah, I just want to ask, what's your take on North Korea accepting the New York Philharmonic Orchestra into Pyongyang? Because it's sort of almost similar to ping pong diplomacy, you know, between China and the United States. But from my perspective, I don't see that it really has had much of that effect.
Well, I think it was potentially important. Unfortunately, the process seems to have gotten derailed. But I mean, it was a North Korean idea, and I think political symbolism matters here on a couple of levels. I think the North Koreans were trying to communicate to an American audience that they weren't all monsters with horns on their heads. I think there was a lot of important domestic symbolism. The concert was broadcast live in North Korea, and for a North Korean radio or TV audience to have an American institution play the Star-Spangled Banner while North Korean officials stand respectfully at attention is pretty important symbolism, that because part of the issue on both sides is a psychology of a half century of misunderstanding, hostility, enmity, and so on. And so I think it was intended to be that. I mean, it's an orchestra. It's not the president, and it They didn't bring any plutonium out of the country or anything like that. But I think it had an important intended symbolism, and I think it reflected the fact at that point things were going relatively well. The general vibes were good. The cooperation in disabling the reactor was moving ahead. The North was getting the bulk of the aid that it had been promised, although a lot of it, for a variety of reasons, was late. And I think it was a kind of goodwill gesture. I mean, we shouldn't exaggerate it, but and now we have this controversy over the delisting, so this may kind of look like an anomaly. But I think at the time it had considerable importance, and the North saw it as a political gesture. One more? Or do you? Yes?
If not, if you don't want to take any more questions.
No. I go on all
Okay,
night. I live and breathe North Korea. I'm happy to talk about it.
You talked about survival of the regime. I was wondering how important survival of the ideology was, if that's something that...
Yeah, I mean, the thing about, the survival is, they have this system. It's based on this kind of dynastic, I've described it as kind of religious cult disguised as country. I mean, you have the Holy Father and the Son and the sacred ideology, Juche, or self-reliance, and a society that's organized around mass worship of the leader. And that's what they want to preserve. And they have calculated that if they can get an accommodation in which that system and government are legitimized by relations with the United States, that will help preserve it. So I think the ideology is very important. But of course, as in China and everywhere else, they want to change policy. They'll say that the new policy fits the old ideology. Whether just like the Chinese came up with socialism with Chinese characteristics, which allow them to go capitalist. The North Koreans have done that, but I don't think that there would be any problem making those adjustments if they felt they needed to.
All right.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
That's great.